Welcome to the Etheria TechCast, where we'll bring you all things science, engineering, technology, and innovation. Today, we are joined by a special guest, Rebecca Beard, an AI and technology career coach and privacy expert. She has led global teams at Fortune 100 companies, including Meta, Gilead Sciences, and Dropbox, and holds an EMBA from Yale. She is also a certified AI governance professional and fellow of information privacy. Rebecca, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me today.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you here today. So, quickly, let's dive in, Rebecca. Your career is, to me, a master class in navigating high stakes environments from AM law firms to leading global teams at Metal and Dropbox. So, what was the core skill or mindset that allowed you to pivot between these different worlds?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things and cornerstone of my career is always staying curious and being open to learning. In all of the roles I've had from, junior analyst to senior manager, I always took on some of the hardest projects, and I highly recommend this for other folks. When you take on some of the gnarliest, most complicated projects and solve for them for the company or for the organization or for your team, you're going to be seen as someone who's a thought leader and who can take on more challenge. So I always highly recommend doing that. And some of the stuff I took on, I wouldn't probably do again, but the learnings and takeaways from those projects have helped me build my career and catapult myself into leadership roles in top companies.
Great. That's really insightful. So let's pull the curtain back a bit. So, having sat in the boardrooms at Fortune 100 companies, Rebecca, what's one thing about the hiring process for AI and tech roles that would completely surprise most candidates?
So one thing I help coach people through is something that surprises people, and I've done hundreds of interviews at these companies, is you're always trying to answer the question, right? In an interview, you've done all your preparation, but sometimes you might get a question, especially at one of these tech companies, that you might not know. And the biggest red flag for a hiring manager is when somebody tries to answer a question that they don't know. So I always recommend to people, be honest with the person. If you don't know something, it's better to be honest and say, hey, I don't have experience in that, and show that candor and show that you have that, that self-awareness versus trying to make up an answer. Cause I've seen people do this time and time again. They're trying to come up with an answer and, they're kind of stumbling, and it just goes to show like they're not being honest and they're not being straightforward with you. So if you don't know something, don't give the answer. Say, be clear about that. Also, another thing I would recommend is if you're unclear on that question in an interview, would be to ask clarifying questions. So, for example, if they're asking me how I would implement a global privacy program, I would respond saying, are you looking at what regions are you looking at? Because Europe is going to be different than Asia versus Africa versus US. So get specific with them, and that shows your curiosity and that you really understand the space, because you're really diving in to get, align with them on the answer they're looking for. So those are two like big takeaways that I've done and seen over hundreds of interviews that I've done at tech companies.
Oh, wow, wow, that's really valuable advice there. So, for the many developers and data scientists in our audience who are brilliant technically but struggle to sell themselves, what is the most effective way to translate complex technical experience into a compelling narrative that a non-technical hiring manager will remember?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I see this time and time again too, where I'm meeting with very technical folks and they start to go down the rabbit hole of explaining all the technicalities. Whereas somebody at a senior level is not going to understand, or it's just too much detail. So what I recommend for people is to have 2 to 3 different stories around something they solved and keep it high level and easy to understand. Also using things like metaphors and making it relatable to a person. So for example, if I'm talking about redoing infrastructure for a company and redoing all the data engineering, maybe relating that to like a car. Like, hey, when you have to do maintenance on a car, you have to change the oil, you have to check the brakes. Well, that's similar to the project I ran where we went in and found all the issues and spot checked and found issues in the code and were able to remediate those specific pieces of code. If you go into the detail about the types of servers, the locations, the code you used, the programming language, you're going to lose people at the top, and especially in the first screen call with a recruiter, because likely that person doesn't have that depth of knowledge in the domain that you're interviewing for. So keep things high level, keep things concise, and try to tell a story around them, and then pause for questions and ask, did that make sense? Do you have any questions around that solution I implemented? So that's some ways you can kind of up level your experience without losing the recruiter or hiring manager in the call.
All right. So, these days you see a lot of professionals trying to pivot into AI. What is the single most common strategic mistake people often make that almost guarantees that they'll get lost in the noise in this AI field? And what are some tips you'd share for people trying to get into this artificial intelligence field, to be able to navigate themselves in this domain without getting lost in the noise?
Yeah, so two things. One is I see a lot of people go out and get certifications and take classes, whereas that's not going to be as valuable as actually implementing a project in your current role, if you're in a current role. Second is one thing I see in interviews a lot now is people using AI interview coaches. More and more companies are coming onto this and understanding that people are doing this. And some of the questions, a lot of it's connected to one of our favorite AIs that, many people use across the world, and I won't name any names. So the questions become identifiable, and you can also see somebody's readings. For example, companies like Google are now requiring interviews to be on site. They're flying people into their headquarters because they even notice so many people are using these AI interviewers. So I would highly recommend to not use one of those. Hiring manager now can tell the responses are very similar. And I've even noticed it in some of the interviews I've conducted when somebody's using it. And it's a hard no when somebody's doing that. So I would say number one, don't do that. What you should be doing is, again, in your current role, working on something AI related. Maybe you work in an insurance company or construction companies. There's ways to implement AI into your current role and leverage it within whatever domain you work in. So get leadership approval to do that and then talk about how you implemented it within the company. It doesn't mean you built, a brand new model, a brand new llama. You don't have to have boiled the ocean to land an AI role, but you do need to have shown some work and be able to speak to how you made impact in that company. So again, don't use the AI trainers if you're very serious for like a big tech company, because it's really easy to now know when someone's doing that.
All right, that was really insightful, and thanks for sharing. I'm sure the listeners will get great value from it. So, Rebecca, I am curious about the human side of your corporate experience. When you were building teams at Meta and Dropbox, what was a soft skill you found incredibly rare, but made all the differences, in a candidate's success once they were hired?
Yeah, I mean, just really being yourself when you're going on site, right when you land on property of that company, showing your real self. So, the story is pretty common. Somebody showed up to an interview, they were rude to the receptionist. Strike one. That receptionist might be best friends with the VP. Being rude to a janitor, being rude to the person making coffee. Be yourself, be cordial, be friendly, be the person everyone wants to work around. If you show up super stiff and not smiling and not friendly with everyone, that's gonna carry through all the way to the hiring people once you get in the room. So right when you step, whether you park your car, you never know who's going to be around you. You can pull up right next to the VP. There's stories where somebody pulled in and took the VP's parking spot and was rude to that person. They walked in for the interview and that was the same person. So be cognizant of how you're acting right when you get there. And then always be professional, be charismatic, and be yourself. You can tell when someone's being like super stiff and fake. And I can tell right away when I'm doing an interview if this is completely somebody's, I mean, unless they're a great actor, and that's happened maybe 1 out of 100. But, being yourself and being relatable, telling stories about relating it back to your actual experience goes a long way. So don't make things up, and just be like as friendly and personable as you can. And I understand like more engineering folks, and I've worked with a lot of these folks, they're more introverted. Practice with a friend or your family, practice what you're gonna say, and that, kind of shake out the nerves. Because if you show up super nervous and like almost scared, and I've had that happen in an interview where someone's just so nervous they can't answer a question. If you practice a bunch of times and like kind of rehearse it, you're gonna be a lot more comfortable in that call and it's gonna come through.
Fantastic. So, as a certified AI governance professional, you've seen the regulatory landscape evolve. So tell us, Rebecca, what's one emerging skill related to AI ethics or privacy that you believe will become non-negotiable for tech professionals in the next 2 years?
Yeah, so right now I still feel like legislation is catching up to the speed of AI. Even with privacy back 10 years ago, regulations didn't come out until after, a lot of the tech was deployed. The same thing is happening in AI right now. So we have the EU AI Act. We have different states in the US passing laws. New York has passed a law. However, the rest of the world is really behind, I'd say, with an exception of a few countries. So as this technology is deployed, governments are going to be slower. So it's really on companies to instill that governance within their organizations because eventually they are going to be responsible for the repercussions of how AI, the good and bad it does. So one thing I think that's going to be non-negotiable is being able to track back how you train your data. And that's something that I've worked on in the past. Knowing how you're training your models, what information is going in to train that models, testing it, having safety models around that data to make sure that no harm is done. And that we can see now there's cases against, a lot of AI companies now for harmful things that have happened. That's going to be more prevalent, especially if companies don't have guardrails around their AIs. And that's becoming more and more like that's going to be a hot job in the next 2 to 3 years, safety training. And that's something like a lot of people are learning and companies are learning as we go. But we will have regulations around that one day.
Great. So, you've coached countless professionals. Is there a particular aha moment or success story from one of your clients that stands out as a perfect example for someone who did everything right?
Yeah, so most recently I had someone, they followed everything to a T. They received 3 offers, competing offers, all with equity, sign-on bonus, and pretty much making 40% more than they were in their prior role in this job market. So I hear a lot of people say, well, I'm not getting a job. The job market's really hot. To me, it's quite the opposite. If you're that needle in a haystack and you're able to hit all of the metrics that companies are looking for, you're going to get multiple offers because you're the type of person that companies are looking for. You're a top performer. You understand things and you're able to execute on a plan when you get into the company. So that's something I help people do. In the first 90 days, I ensure they're successful. They're hitting their plan. Those first 90 days are the most important because that's your first impression at the company. And you're going to get the top bonus, top equity refreshers because of that.
Okay, so looking at your own path, Rebecca, what was a career risk or perhaps failure that felt devastating at the time, but ultimately set you on the right course to where you are right now?
Yeah, so I was working at a company and I was building out their teams, scaling to multiple offices across the US, taking on probably 80% of the team's work, managing, hiring, kind of doing 3 people's jobs. And I asked, "Hey, can I get a raise? Can I get a promotion?" Month after month, it was no. And I knew I was one of the top performers there. A lot of the leadership would come to me when there was something urgent because they knew I would execute on getting that thing done. So I had, a death in my family, and that made me realize, like, life's too short. I know I'm more valuable than, what they're paying me. So I put in my 2-week notice. Immediately, my boss called me and offered me double my pay. I said no. It was too little, too late. And, what I tell people is know your worth. And I talk to a lot of people and they tell me how much they're making, how much experience they have. And I'm like, you're drastically getting underpaid for what you know and what you're doing. So that's something that really changed my whole career path because after I quit, I went on to work for a company where I was making 4 times more and working probably half of the hours. And I was able to spend time with my family and enjoy the money. So that's what I tell people, like, if you're being taken advantage of in a role, and this happens to everybody, you don't realize it when you're in the weeds, but when you can take a step back and see what the market is and what's out there, really take a chance on yourself because you will be able to find something better if you're a top performer and if you have that technical expertise. There are jobs out there. I don't want people to be discouraged about the news that there's not a lot of jobs because for the right people, there are jobs out there.
Great. That's a really inspiring story there, Rebecca. So, for the early career professionals and students who who are listening and feel overwhelmed by the competition, so what is one tangible, high impact action that they can take to start strengthening their candidacy for a future in tech?
Yeah, so I talk to a lot of people and they're like, well, again, back to the certifications or they're about to get their bachelor's degree. They're like, well, I'm going to get a master's degree and a PhD. And I'm like, why? The best thing you can do after your bachelor's or any degree is to get a job because then you can start to get an understanding and a lay of the land and get experience under your belt. If you go right into a master's PhD, I almost did a PhD and thank God I didn't because at the end of the day, getting work experience today is going to be more valuable than getting a PhD unless there's some other reason you want to do it besides career. I would say get a job first, start getting experience, and then figure out the next steps. And in fact, when I went to go work for one of the companies, they helped pay for my master's degree later. And I did it at night while I was working. Getting a job is the best thing you can do and start getting experience. And from there, you can move up into tech or AI once you have experience.
Okay, I like to, elaborate. I'd like you to elaborate on this particular thought-provoking statement that you made. Getting work experience, it's more important than getting a PhD. So, how did you come up to that conclusion? Are there any metrics of comparison that you did that
Mhm.
now made you finalize on the fact that, getting a work experience after your bachelor's or master's, perhaps it's more important than getting a PhD?
Even the master's. So a lot of people I talk to, they're like, I just came out of my bachelor's. Now I'm going to go get a master's. They're going to go into debt, likely, unless someone's paying for it. So they're going to take on debt that's going to be accumulating. They are not going to have any work experience. So when they graduate with their master's, it's going to be even harder to get a job because you have no work experience. Third is if you start working, there's a likelihood that that company could help you pay for your master's if you want to do it part time, or even there's executive programs where you can do it during the summer or at night. So I have just seen a huge delta in the pay of people and people I've hired. There's even now tech companies that hire people without a college degree if you can pass their technical loops. that are making $200,000 to $300,000 a year with, a bachelor's degree. And again, once you're making money, it's very easy to then go pay and get a master's degree if you still want to do that. But I always recommend, especially if you took on debt to get your bachelor's degree, start working so you can get out of debt and then leverage the company to either help you pay or get more training or move up in your career. The master's and the PhD are becoming less and less table stakes to get into these companies. Unless you're like a very, very specialized role, which is likely going to be like 0.01% of the people, I wouldn't recommend it. You're going to get this, if not better experience on the ground in a job.
That's quite insightful. So, the future of work is a hot topic. Beyond learning just to use AI tools, what does future-proofing a tech career truly look like from your vantage point? Is it about specialization, generalization, or something else entirely?
I think it's going to be the people that can understand and implement AI. So I don't like to say, like, don't be a generalist, of course, because you're going to be like, I've talked to people that are like, I want to be a product manager. I want to be a marketing manager. I want to be a finance manager. Like, pick one thing because you do need to build your career and expertise on something. When you get into that role, leverage AI, learn AI, have an open mindset because the company and leadership will see this person is nimble and we can put them in. That's what happened to me. They put me into an AI team because there was a huge need. They're like, this person can pivot and start executing here. They can learn. So be someone who's always learning in the role and be like I said in the very beginning, be that person when they're like, hey, nobody wants this piece of crap project because it's so complicated and nobody wants to touch it. Be the person who's like, hey, I'll do that. And you're going to get visibility with leadership because it's a problem that needs to get solved for the company. And they're going to be like, hey, that person can help us figure out AI. That person can help us scale this. So the more visibility you get with leadership, the more opportunities you're going to get.
Amazing, amazing. So, if you could give just one piece of advice to a young person entering a STEM field today about managing their long-term career, not just their first job, Rebecca, what would it be?
It would be that if it's too good to be true, it's probably not a good opportunity. Anything that's a get rich quick scheme is probably a scam. Things are not going to happen overnight. So you need to be patient, put in the work and the time, and you will be successful. I've had jobs where I'm like just grinding, 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 but the amount of things that I learned, I was able to leverage into a role where I was making a lot more money. So again, like you're going to need to do the work. Don't think, oh, okay, this shiny object syndrome, sign me up. I'm going to make a lot of money. If you don't have the expertise to execute on that, you're not going to last very long. And I've seen this happen where people last a few months and they let them go because they somehow passed the interview, but they weren't able to actually execute on the role. So make sure you do the work so that you can execute on the role, and that's how you're going to leverage to move up in your career.
All right. So, in your work, guiding people through the intersection of technology, business, and personal growth, I'd like to ask, what does the word innovation truly mean to you, and how have you applied it to, a human career?
Yeah, and again, I think a lot of it comes from yourself. So if you're in an environment that's very collaborative and learning, some of the best ideas on my team came from junior employees. Be vocal, tell your leadership when there's issues, and always give a solution. That solution might not get implemented, but you're seen as somebody who's solution driven, who's not just complaining. So that's where a lot of the innovation comes, especially at Meta. A lot of the best ideas came from the bottom up. We're a very collaborative company, and some of the coolest products that came out of where my main focus was in reality labs came from people who saw a problem, came up with the solution. We got bought in from leadership and were able to implement it. And it's really cool to now see billions of people using those products. So I would say like don't be shy to present your ideas. Even if it doesn't work, over time, you might hit something big, and that's gonna help you land a promotion or land a big bonus.
Right, that's a great one there. So, finally, for our listeners who are ready to take the next step and want your direct guidance, what's the best way for them to connect with you or learn more about your coaching?
Yeah, great question. So I have a channel on Instagram and YouTube, Rebecca Beard AI. I have tons of tips on there that you can watch. And if you want to get in contact with me, just DM me and we can set up a call.
Great. So, Rebecca, it's been a conversation filled with insights with you, and I'm excited to have you on the show today.
Awesome. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Eskill.